The month was March 1945, the year the world held its breath. Germany was collapsing from within, its cities nothing but bones under a gray sky. The war's final winter bit like a starving animal, and the wind that swept through the valleys carried no songs, only the groan of the dying Reich. Near the Rhine, a farmhouse still stood amid the wreckage, blackened by smoke but stubborn against surrender. Inside it, a young widow named Elsa knelt by a cold hearth, coaxing a flame from splinters of a broken chair leg. Her hands trembled not from the cold alone but from the memory of warmth, something she hadn't felt since the telegram arrived a year ago, the one that said her husband was missing in action, presumed dead on the Eastern Front. She didn't cry anymore. The tears had dried months earlier, buried with the last loaf of bread and the last illusion that the war could still be won. Now she moved through her days like someone crossing a frozen river, careful not to break the silence beneath her feet. Her mother-in-law, brittle as old parchment, sat by the window wrapped in rags, whispering prayers to a God who had grown deaf to Germany. And in the corner, beneath a quilt too thin to matter, slept a boy of 7, Karl, the neighbor's child, whose parents had vanished during the last evacuation. Elsa had found him 2 winters ago, half-starved in the orchard. He hadn't spoken much since. Sometimes she wondered if silence was the only language the living still understood. Outside, snow flurried across the ruined field, softening the scars of tank tracks that had cut through weeks ago. The front was moving west, everyone said. The Americans were coming. The Russians were behind them. There was nowhere left to run. In the distance, she could still hear the dull thump of artillery, like a giant heartbeat echoing through the valley. Every sound carried meaning now, the crunch of boots, the clatter of rifles, the low hum of engines that could mean life or death. She had learned to listen the way a priest listens for confession. The sun, what little of it broke through, hung pale over the horizon, a coin spent long ago. Elsa scraped the bottom of a tin for flour, her fingers ghost-white with dust. She measured every handful as though it were time itself, rationed and slipping away. The boy stirred, murmuring in dreams of bread and warmth, and she smiled faintly. "Shoo," she whispered, "sleep, it's better in dreams." Her voice cracked, hoarse from silence, weary from waiting. Each day she woke expecting to find soldiers at her door. Each night she counted the hours between distant explosions and the next dawn. The war had stripped her of everything except routine. Fetch water from the well, mend what could still be mended, pray the next bomb fell somewhere else. Yet beneath that rhythm, something fragile still lived, a pulse that refused to die. She kept her husband's coat hanging by the door, its buttons polished though no one would wear it again. And every evening, when the wind howled through the broken shutters, she lit a candle in the window. Not for faith, not for victory, but so that if by some miracle he wandered home, he would see the light and know she had waited. One afternoon, the silence cracked. A convoy thundered down the road beyond the trees, engines coughing, foreign voices shouting through the mist. Elsa froze mid-step, flour spilling from her hands. The mother-in-law crossed herself. The boy pressed against her skirt. She peeked through the window slats. The soldiers wore helmets she didn't recognize, rounder, darker, glinting beneath the gray. White stars painted on steel. Americans. She had heard stories. Some said they shot surrendering men, others that they handed out cigarettes and chocolate. Both could be true. War made monsters and saints from the same flesh. They passed without stopping. Hours later, only silence remained, deeper now, as though the world had paused to breathe. That night, Elsa couldn't sleep. The candle burned low, throwing soft gold across the cracked walls. She sat by the window, watching snow fall through the moonlight. Her thoughts drifted to the husband she would never see again, the promises whispered under apple blossoms before the war. She wondered if he had died quickly or if he had called her name. She wondered if the Americans prayed for their dead the same way Germans did. Beneath the questions, an ache bloomed. Not anger, not fear, but a longing for something beyond nations. A simple human mercy. In the morning, she walked to the barn. The roof had half collapsed, but inside, The air was still heavy with straw and the faint scent of animals long gone. She gathered what she could find, humming a lullaby she barely remembered. The boy trailed her steps, holding a cracked tin cup. "Will they come here?" he whispered. It was the first thing he'd said in days. She paused, looked at him, then at the horizon where smoke rose like a second dawn. "They already have," she said softly. That evening brought the kind of cold that bites through bone. She patched the window with rags, tightened the shutters, and prayed the roof would hold through the night. The world outside was changing, but in this small house, time had frozen. The clock above the hearth had stopped ticking in 1942, yet she never took it down. The hands still pointed to 6, a moment before the world went dark. She stirred a thin soup over the fire, the smell of turnips barely masking the smoke that crept through the cracks. The boy coughed in his sleep. Her mother-in-law's breathing came shallow. Elsa rubbed her arms, feeling the chill settle into her blood. Then she heard it, faint at first, then clearer. The crunch of snow under heavy boots. Not the steady rhythm of a march, too slow, too uncertain. She set the spoon down, listening. One set of steps. Close. Her heart stuttered. She doused the lamp, the room sinking into shadow. The boy woke, eyes wide. She pressed a finger to her lips. The steps stopped outside the door. For a moment, there was nothing. No wind, no breath, only the sound of her pulse pounding in her ears. A soft knock. Once, then again. Not the pounding of soldiers, but something hesitant, human. Elsa moved closer, every instinct screaming to hide, to protect the child. She reached for the old kitchen knife lying on the counter. The metal felt cold and thin against her palm. The mother-in-law whispered a prayer behind her, voice trembling like candlelight. Another knock, slower this time, followed by a voice, low and careful, speaking German with an accent she didn't know. "Ich bin nicht hier, Ihnen weh zu tun. I'm not here to hurt you." Her breath caught. The words hung in the air, heavy with something she couldn't name, truth, maybe, or desperation. Through the narrow crack of the door, she saw a shadow, tall and broad-shouldered, helmet glinting faintly in the dying light. Not German, not Russian. The star on his sleeve shone ghostly white. Elsa stood frozen, the knife trembling in her hand. Behind her, the boy whimpered. The stranger spoke again, softer now, his voice nearly lost beneath the wind. "Please." It wasn't a command. It was the sound of a man at the edge of exhaustion, or mercy. Her grip faltered. Every memory of the war surged through her. The bombings, the hunger, the faces of neighbors dragged away for saying the wrong thing. Every instinct told her to bar the door. But another voice, quieter and deeper, whispered something else. Not all enemies arrive to destroy. The wind rattled the shutters, snow swept against the door, and for a long heartbeat, the world stood still. Then Elsa did something she didn't understand even as she did it. She reached for the latch. The door creaked open an inch, letting in a rush of cold air and the scent of iron and rain. The soldier's face came into view, pale beneath dirt and blood, eyes hollow but kind. His rifle hung low, barrel pointed toward the ground. He looked at her the way a drowning man looks at the shore. For the first time in months, Elsa's heart beat not from fear, but from something dangerously close to hope. The fire behind her flickered, casting both their shadows across the ruined wall. Two strangers caught between survival and surrender. Somewhere far off, artillery thundered again, shaking the night. But inside that small farmhouse, another kind of silence took root, the kind that comes before something changes forever. The soldier's breath came in ragged bursts, his boots sinking into the slush of the road as twilight bled through the forest. He had been walking for hours, perhaps days. The world around him had blurred into gray fog and phantom shapes. Bare trees, charred cottages, the remnants of what had once been Germany. Private Daniel Harlan of the 9th Armored Division had lost his map, his squad, and the radio connection that tethered him to sanity. All he had left was his rifle, his heartbeat, and the stubborn will not to die in a country that wasn't his own. The war was supposed to be ending, but in his eyes, the end looked no different from the beginning. Mud, ghosts, and silence. He'd been part of the forces that crossed the Ludendorff Bridge days earlier, the moment that cracked open the Rhine like a scar. Command said it was history. To Daniel, it was chaos. Smoke thicker than night, men screaming through static, the sound of metal twisting as artillery turned the sky into fire. Somewhere in that blur, his platoon scattered. He remembered diving into a crater, the impact shattering his helmet strap. When he climbed out, the world had shifted, the others were gone, the horizon empty. He followed the sound of distant gunfire until it, too, faded into snow. Now there was only this: a wounded leg, an empty canteen, and a farmhouse light flickering in the distance like a promise he no longer believed in. When he reached the gate, his body nearly gave out. He leaned against the wooden post, forcing his breath to steady. The house looked abandoned, its roof sagging, walls bruised by weather and war. Yet a faint trail of smoke rose from the chimney, thin and steady. Life. He hesitated, knowing what that meant. Civilians. Germans. The people he was ordered to protect and sometimes shoot. But his vision blurred, his legs trembling under exhaustion. He could barely feel his fingers. The decision was made by instinct, not reason. He raised his hand and knocked, soft but deliberate. The wind carried away the sound. He knocked again, harder this time. A pause. Then, from within, the faint shuffle of movement. He spoke the first words that came to mind, the only ones that mattered. Ich bin nicht hier, innen WW2. His accent betrayed him, but his tone carried what the words could not. Truth. I'm not here to hurt you. For a long heartbeat, there was nothing. Then the door creaked open, a sliver of light spilling into the dark. He saw her, pale face framed by a kerchief, eyes wide but unflinching, a knife trembling in her hand. Behind her, shadows, an old woman and a boy. The soldier lowered his rifle instantly, letting it hang from his shoulder. Please, he said, voice breaking under fatigue. I just need a place to rest. She hesitated, the silence between them thick with everything unspoken. Fear, hatred, mercy. Finally, she stepped aside. One night, she said quietly. Only one. Her German was soft but sharp, like the edge of glass. He nodded, stepping into the warmth of the room, his boots leaving trails of melted snow on the wooden floor. The air smelled of smoke, bread, and something fragile. Hope, maybe, or its ghost. The boy hid behind her skirt, watching him with wide, hollow eyes. Daniel crouched slightly, offering a small smile. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a chocolate bar, its wrapper crumpled but intact. He tore it in half and set one piece on the table, sliding it toward the child. For you, he murmured. The boy didn't move. The widow's eyes darted between them, suspicion softening into something else. She took the chocolate, broke it again, and handed the smallest piece to the boy, the rest to her mother-in-law. Only when they began to eat did Daniel realize how long it had been since any of them had tasted sweetness. He sat near the fire, letting the heat lick at his numb fingers. She kept her distance, arms folded, gaze sharp. You're American, she said finally. He nodded. 9th Armored. The title meant nothing to her, but his accent did. You shouldn't be here, she said. There are soldiers nearby. He gave a dry laugh. There are soldiers everywhere. The humor died in his throat when he noticed the thin band of gold on her finger, dull, worn, still polished by habit. Widow, he thought. They always had the same look. Not grief, not even sorrow, just the absence of everything that used to matter. The old woman muttered a prayer in the corner. The fire crackled. He closed his eyes, exhaustion crashing over him in waves. When he woke, the room was dimmer, the candle burned low. A blanket had been thrown over his shoulders, her doing, though she said nothing about it. He murmured a thank you. She didn't answer. She was mending a tear in her skirt, needle flashing in the candlelight. You have family? He asked softly. She hesitated. Had? She replied. One word, heavy as the world outside. He nodded slowly. Me too. She glanced at him then, something shifting behind her eyes. For the first time, he looked less like an invader and more like a boy far from home. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small photograph. Creased, rain-stained, edges nearly gone. A woman and a baby, smiling beneath an American sky. "My wife," he said quietly. "And my girl. She was born a week before I left." He tried to smile but failed. "Guess she'll be walking before I get back." The widow's hands stilled. The sound of the needle stopped. "You will go back," she said, not as comfort but as fact. "The war will end soon." He met her gaze. "And then what?" he asked. "What ends when you've seen what we've seen?" The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of things neither could say. The candle guttered. Shadows moved across the walls like memories. She stood and went to the window, looking out into the night. Snow fell in thin sheets, glowing faintly under the moon. "When this is over," she murmured, "the world will not know what to do with peace." He listened, and for the first time since he crossed the Rhine, he felt the truth of it. War had consumed everything. Names, faces, faith, and now, even its survivors would have to learn how to live among the ashes. He reached for the flask at his belt, took a sip, and winced. "Water?" she asked. "Whiskey," he replied. Then, after a pause, he extended it toward her. "For the end of the world." She hesitated, then took it, her fingers brushing his. The contact was brief but electric, the kind that makes you aware of how alive you still are. She drank, coughed, and almost laughed. A sound so foreign it startled them both. "It burns," she said. "That's how you know it's real," he answered. Time slipped quietly after that. He told her about Ohio, cornfields, summer rain, the smell of gasoline and grass after a storm. She listened, eyes distant, as if trying to imagine a sky not filled with bombers. In return, she told him about her orchard, how the apples used to turn gold in September. Her voice softened as she spoke, and for a fleeting moment, it felt like they were two strangers sharing a table in a world untouched by war. But outside, the wind reminded them where they were, Germany, 1945, where mercy could still get a person killed. When she finally rose, she said, "You can sleep by the fire. Leave before dawn." He nodded. "Thank you." She lingered at the door, watching him settle, the fatigue dragging him into sleep. Her gaze lingered on his face, the boyish lines beneath the dirt, the faint tremor in his hands. She wondered if he had killed anyone, if his eyes had seen what hers had. She wondered if he dreamed of home, or if soldiers no longer dared to dream. Sometime in the night, she woke to the sound of him murmuring in his sleep. At first, she thought it was English, but then she caught fragments. Names pleased the word sorry. He twisted in pain, his body shaking. Without thinking, she knelt beside him, laying a hand on his shoulder. His skin burned with fever. His eyes fluttered open, wild and lost, until they found hers. For a moment, neither spoke. Then, in a voice barely audible, he whispered, "Don't let them find me." She didn't ask who. She just nodded. The wind howled outside. Snow pressed against the shutters, sealing them in a fragile pocket of warmth and uncertainty. She poured water into a cloth and laid it across his forehead. He gripped her wrist weakly, his fingers trembling. "Why are you helping me?" he asked. She looked at him for a long time before answering. "Because someone has to." Her voice was steady, but her eyes betrayed the tremor of belief returning to a heart that had forgotten how to feel. He released her hand, his breathing slowing. The fire dimmed to embers. She sat there long after he drifted back to sleep, watching the soft rise and fall of his chest. Outside, the horizon began to pale, the first hint of dawn. But with the light came danger. Patrols would soon return. The boy stirred. The old woman whispered a prayer. Elsa stood, staring at the soldier who had knocked at dusk, and realized that the world outside their door was ending. But something fragile and terrifyingly human had begun inside. The night settled heavy over the farmhouse, pressing down like a held breath. Outside, the snow had stopped, leaving the fields covered in a silence so complete it felt sacred. Inside, The air was thick with the scent of smoke and the quiet pulse of firelight. The soldier slept uneasily on the floor, his body curled toward the hearth, his face flickering between shadow and flame. Elsa sat nearby, mending a sleeve by the dim glow, her eyes moving not on the thread but on him, on the foreigner who had brought a strange kind of stillness into her home. For the first time in years, the silence didn't terrify her. It hummed softly, like a fragile truce between worlds. Every now and then he stirred, muttering words in English she couldn't understand. His breath came shallow, his brow damp with fever. She rose quietly, dipped a cloth in cool water, and pressed it against his forehead. His skin burned beneath her touch. When she drew her hand away, he caught her wrist in his sleep. Reflex, fear, something deeper. And for a moment she froze, the tension coiled like wire between them. Then his grip loosened, his hand falling back to his chest. She didn't move right away. The feel of his palm, the weight of another's warmth, was something she had forgotten. The wind outside rattled the shutters, but the house held. The fire cracked softly, sending up little sighs of ash. The old woman had gone to bed, and the boy slept near the wall, his breathing small and even. Elsa felt the kind of fatigue that went beyond the body. It was the exhaustion of surviving too long. She looked down at the soldier again and wondered what had driven him to her door. Fate, chance, or simply the need to be seen as human again. War stripped men of that first, she thought. Maybe kindness could give it back, even for one night. When she checked the wound on his arm, she saw that the bandage she'd tied earlier had bled through. She fetched the lamp, unwound the cloth, and cleaned the gash with trembling care. It wasn't deep, but infection could kill as surely as a bullet. He woke halfway through, flinching under her touch, eyes snapping open in confusion. For a heartbeat he didn't know where he was. His hand reached instinctively for his weapon. But then recognition dawned, and the tension bled out of his body. "You're still here," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "You should rest," she said. "You have fever." He gave a faint, weary smile. "I've had worse. Korea, the training fields, even home sometimes." She didn't understand all of it, but his tone carried the meaning. Home wasn't safe for anyone anymore. She poured him a small tin of water, and he drank greedily, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. "Thank you," he murmured. "For the fire. For this." She nodded, uncertain how to answer. Words felt clumsy under the weight of what surrounded them. "My husband was a soldier," she said quietly, surprising herself. "He never came back." His eyes softened, a flicker of recognition passing through them. "A lot of men didn't," he said. "War eats people faster than it counts them." She glanced toward the window, where the snow glowed faintly under the moon. "Do you think it ever ends?" He thought for a moment before answering. "The fighting ends, but the war, it stays inside." That truth lingered between them, gentle and merciless. The fire popped. A log fell inward, collapsing into embers. Elsa reached out, pushing it back with the poker. Her sleeve brushed his arm. He didn't move. "I used to dream," she said after a long pause. "About music, about colors. I don't anymore. I think war steals sound first, then light." He looked at her, studying the faint lines of her face, the quiet strength that came not from defiance but endurance. "Maybe it's still there," he said. "You just stopped believing you could hear it." She smiled faintly. "You talk like a priest." He chuckled under his breath. "No, just a man trying to remember who he was before the uniform." They fell into silence again, but it was different now. Softer, the kind that holds instead of isolates. Outside, a dog barked in the distance, then stopped. The world beyond their walls remained cold and watchful, but inside, time seemed to fold. Two enemies made neighbors by exhaustion. The boy stirred in his sleep, mumbling, and Elsa tucked the blanket around him. When she turned back, the soldier was staring into the flames. "Do they hate us?" he asked quietly, still looking at the fire. She frowned. "Who?" "Your people. The Americans." His voice was thin but steady. They call us liberators, but we come with guns and burn their homes. I look at you, and I don't know what side I'm on anymore." She studied him for a moment before answering. "Maybe sides are what make the killing easy. You stop seeing faces." He nodded slowly, his jaw tight. "Back home they said we were fighting monsters. But the first time I saw a German soldier die, he was just a boy. Couldn't have been 18. He kept calling for his mother." His voice broke on the last word. "I still hear it sometimes. In the dark." Elsa felt something stir in her chest, an ache too old to name. "You think you are the only one haunted," she said softly. "We bury our sons, our husbands. We tell our children they are heroes. But the graves don't care what language the prayers are in." She paused, her throat tightening. "In the end, everyone loses the same way." He looked up at her then, and for a fleeting second, the war vanished. There was no uniform, no accent, no flag. Only two survivors trying to keep the world from falling apart inside them. The firelight caught the edge of her hair, turning it to gold. He wanted to say something. Apology, confession, maybe just gratitude, but his voice wouldn't come. Instead, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded scrap of paper. "This was supposed to be a letter home," he said. "Didn't have the courage to finish it." He handed it to her. She took it carefully, unfolding the creased lines. The writing was uneven, some words smudged by rain. She could make out only fragments. "Snow, baby, forgive me." At the bottom, a line stood out, clear as glass. "If I don't make it, tell her I tried to stay kind." She folded it back and returned it. "You have," she said simply. He looked at her, searching for belief, then gave a small nod. "Maybe," he murmured. "But kindness won't keep me alive if they find me here." The words pulled her back to the present, to the sound of distant engines rolling somewhere in the valley. The front was closing in again. "They will search the houses," she said. "You can't stay when the light comes." He met her eyes. "I'll be gone before dawn." But neither of them moved to make it true. Hours passed, marked only by the slow burn of the fire. At some point, she leaned against the wall, half asleep, her head tilted toward the warmth. He watched her in the dim light, studying the softness that sleep returned to her face, the peace she didn't know she still carried. It made something tighten in his chest, the kind of ache that wasn't fear or hunger but the memory of tenderness. He reached out, almost unconsciously, brushing a lock of hair from her cheek. She stirred but didn't wake. For that brief moment, the war outside had no claim on them. When he finally lay back down, the quiet returned. The wind shifted, brushing snow against the window panes. He stared into the ceiling beams, listening to the rhythm of her breathing, the soft crackle of the dying fire. In the darkness, he whispered, "Not to her, not to anyone. Don't forget me." The words drifted upward, weightless, dissolving into the wood and stone. Before dawn, the first sound came, distant engines, faint but growing. Elsa woke instantly. The soldier was already on his feet, pulling on his coat, pain flashing through his movements. Their eyes met across the room. She wanted to tell him to stay hidden, to wait until it passed, but something deeper told her that safety was no longer possible. He slung his rifle over his shoulder, his breath visible in the cold air. "Thank you," he said. She stepped closer, pressing a small loaf of bread into his hand, the last of her flour. "Go through the orchard," she said quietly. "The trees will hide you until the ridge." For a moment, neither moved. Then he leaned forward, gently touching her hand. "You saved my life," he said. "Don't let them take yours." She wanted to reply, to say something that would last beyond the dawn, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, she gave a single nod. He opened the door, the cold rushing in like a wave. For an instant, the rising light outlined him against the white horizon. Then he turned toward the orchard, disappearing into the mist. Elsa stood in the doorway long after he was gone, the sound of engines drawing nearer. When she finally closed the door, she realized her hands were shaking. Not from fear, but from the weight of something far more dangerous. The memory of mercy. The morning came pale and brittle, a thin ribbon of light threading through the fog that draped the valley. The snow had hardened overnight, crusted like glass across the fields, and the air carried that fragile quiet which comes after too much noise. Elsa stood by the window, her fingers resting on the frosted sill, watching the faint imprint of footsteps vanish into the orchard. The soldier was gone. Only the memory of his whisper remained, soft as the steam rising from the fire. "I'm not here to hurt you." She repeated the words under her breath, as if saying them might hold the world together a little longer. Beyond the orchard, the low hum of engines grew into a steady rhythm. The Americans were near. Their voices drifted faintly, young, careless, alive. Elsa's pulse quickened. She moved through the house silently, hiding what little she had left that could be mistaken for contraband. An old Luger her husband had buried under the floorboards, his photograph, the faded uniform coat still hanging by the door. She covered the hearth's glow and whispered for the boy to stay still. But the knock, when it came, was not hesitant this time. It was sharp, authoritative, final. 2 soldiers stepped inside, their boots crunching over straw and dirt. Their faces were young, their laughter abrupt and foreign. One called out in broken German, demanding to know if anyone else was here. She shook her head, her heart hammering, every muscle poised to betray her. They searched quickly, eyes glancing over the corners, the shelves, the bed. One lifted the blanket the boy hid beneath. The other checked the cellar door. When they found nothing, their tones softened. They weren't cruel, just tired. One of them even handed the boy a piece of gum before they left. Still, Elsa didn't breathe until the sound of their voices faded into the distance. She stepped outside once the quiet returned. The sky was pale blue now, smoke from distant fires staining it like bruises. The orchard stood skeletal in the cold. Branches stretched toward the horizon where the Rhine shimmered faintly under the rising sun. Somewhere beyond that river, the war was collapsing, one regime dying as another moved in. She walked between the trees, her boots sinking into frozen earth, searching the snow for footprints. They led toward the ridge, where the mist thinned into light. But halfway there, she found something else. A small scrap of fabric caught on a thorn, torn from a soldier's sleeve. American olive drab. She took it gently, closing her hand around it like a relic. Behind her, the farmhouse looked smaller than ever, a solitary breath against a landscape of ruin. The sound of distant artillery echoed again, though faint now, final strokes of a dying storm. She could almost imagine the world exhaling, weary of its own cruelty. She turned toward the horizon, her eyes stinging from the brightness. The war would end soon. Everyone said so. But endings, she knew, came slowly for those who had lived too long inside them. By noon, the Americans had crossed further east, leaving behind scattered trucks, wounded men, and the smell of oil and ash. Elsa watched them from a distance, clutching her shawl tight against the wind. She saw faces younger than her husband had been when he left, boys who looked both victorious and hollow. They tossed cigarettes to children, shared rations with the hungry. Some waved when they saw her. She didn't wave back. She just stood there, caught between gratitude and something she couldn't name, something that hurt like forgiveness. Inside, the boy sat by the fire, playing with a tin soldier the American had left behind. The old woman hummed softly, the sound thin but steady. The room felt changed somehow, as if the air itself had shifted. Elsa looked at the empty space where the stranger had slept and imagined his voice again, quiet, steady, filled with a strange, unguarded gentleness. She wondered if he had made it across the river, if he would remember the widow in the farmhouse who gave him shelter when the world was collapsing. Or perhaps she was already fading into the endless catalogue of things soldiers tried to forget. That evening, she found herself lighting the candle again, the one she used to keep for her husband. His flame trembled in the draught but held firm. The light flickered against the walls, casting twin shadows, one of a woman, one of a soldier. She sat beside it, her hands clasped, not in prayer but remembrance. Outside, The sky deepened into gold, the sun sinking over the Rhine, and for a moment, it looked like the world itself was on fire. But this time, the fire felt like peace. As dusk fell, a sound drifted from far off. A truck engine, maybe, or the low rumble of retreating artillery. But beneath it came something else. A voice. Faint, carried by the wind. She couldn't make out the words, but it was enough. She stepped to the door, her breath clouding in the cold, and stared toward the orchard one last time. The snow there glowed under the fading light, marked by faint trails leading east. Somewhere out there, a man walked toward a war's end, carrying the memory of mercy in a land that had forgotten it. Elsa closed the door slowly, her palm resting on the wood as if it could still feel his warmth. The candlelight shimmered against her face, soft and unguarded. For the first time in years, her hands stopped trembling. The war outside might still roar, but within her, something quiet had taken root. It was not love, not hope, not yet, but the faint promise of both. She whispered to the silence, her voice steady, almost reverent. Go in peace. The fire sighed, the candle swayed, and through the window, the dawn's last light glimmered over the Rhine like a silver thread stitching two broken worlds together. And in that fragile hour, as night folded back into morning, Elsa understood what the war had failed to teach her. That peace does not arrive with flags or parades, but in the quiet between strangers who choose, even for a moment, not to hate.